Thanks everyone for being here today, and I want to thank Dr. Barr and the Lone State College Writers, Speakers, and Ideas Committee for inviting me to come here and share my work with you today. I don't have to tell you much about that work because Dr. Barr just did a great job doing it, but in case you haven't already figured it out, today we're going to be looking mostly at my recovery and discovery work and talking about the history of women in science fiction. All right, slide please. This is like the best power you ever get as a professor when you're giving lectures and someone else advances your slides. This never happens at home. All right, cool. So, as you may or may not know, a lot of you are science fiction fans already, right? Excellent. So you might know that last year, 2018, was, according to the media, the year of the woman, and that was certainly true in science fiction. 2018 was the bicentennial of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is often considered by many people to be the first modern work of science fiction. It was the first commercially successful science fiction novel. It was also the year that N.K. Jemisin won her third Hugo in a row. That's her at the very end, holding up this trophy there. And Nora Jemisin is the first person of any race or class or color or gender or species, even for that matter, to win 3 Hugos in a row. And the Hugo is like winning the Oscars of science fiction, so this was a big deal. Right. Other things that happened that year, women in media really took the lead in media science fiction. Women were featured in blockbusters including Annihilation, Bumblebee, A Wrinkle in Time, and in fact, speaking of A Wrinkle in Time, Ava DuVernay, the director of that movie, became the first black woman to direct a film with a blockbuster budget. Women also made significant strides in gaming last year, and in particular, video game programmer Brianna Wu ran for Congress on a platform that emphasized privacy rights and the elimination of online harassment. This is really exciting to me because for a long time it was really common to assume that science fiction was about boys and their toys. But as more women join the field and as the science fiction archive opens up, we're starting to realize that just isn't really true. Science fiction and fantasy are global languages, you've already heard about that a little bit, that allow us to communicate our experiences of science, technology, and society to each other across centuries, continents, and cultures. And women have very much helped shape those conversations since the beginning of the genre itself. Like their male counterparts, women write about everything from sleek spaceships and strange alien encounters to the future of planet Earth and humanity itself. But women have also always staked claims for themselves and for all women in the future imaginary by telling stories that ask readers to think very specifically about the relations of science, technology, and gender. To do this, they've had to create new story types and new character types that remind audiences that the future can be female, and in doing so, they end up advancing science fiction itself. Slide, please. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna start at the beginning here, and I hope you're ready because we're gonna run through about 100 years of history in 30 minutes. I know you're like, oh goodness, but we can do it, you can do it. Also, I want to let you know, please feel free, if any of these slides interest you, please feel free to take out your cameras or whatever and photograph them, or I can talk to you about them later on. I'm happy to do that. But I'm hoping that'll turn you on to some good stories and you'll want to check them out. So we're going to begin way back at the beginning in the pulp era of science fiction. So the pulp era, as you can see, runs from about the 1920s to the 1940s, and these are all rough dates. But this is the moment when science fiction became a distinct popular genre, when it suddenly had its own authors and editors, its own publishing venues, and its own rules for what counted as good writing. This occurs, as you realize, right around the same time as universal suffrage, as the fight for women to get the vote. So it's no surprise that from a beginning you see women in science fiction, just as women are storming all kinds of other professions at that time. They were in the science fiction community. And from the beginning, they're a small but very vocal minority, about 15% of the community. And I include authors, editors, and artists in that as well. In general, women were welcomed into the field by men, including science fiction founding father Hugo Gernsback. And remember that name, you'll hear it again in a minute. Now, most of the first women in science fiction were white and middle class, but we also do have a few women of color who were in the mix at this time as well. These were largely women of mixed indigenous ancestry. Almost to a T, these women were well educated. They were amongst the first generation of women who pursued college degrees, and they were well traveled. Many of them traveled across America and across the world. They created the first female heroines, the first black heroes, and the first aliens who collaborated with humans. Women also won some of the first science fiction awards, and one woman in particular, Lilith Lorraine, received the first, and as far as I know, the only FBI file to date for seditious science fiction poetry. So when your country's at war, don't write a poem called Capitalism Comes to Judgment. It does not go over well at all. All right, great. Now, women who were in the field at this time, even though this was a moment of feminist activity, they really saw their main work in the field as helping to build the genre, and then, of course, secondarily, staking claims for women within it. This was done through the creation of what we call the Shero, a female hero with the strength, intelligence, and stubbornness of her male counterpart. The difference between the hero and the Shero is that the Shero rejects the kind of rugged individualism and division from nature that we often see the classic hero associated with, and instead she embraces a moral framework for action based on connection and community. So we can see this a little bit in this first set of slides here. The first three covers are from magazines. They're covers from stories that were written by men. And interestingly, when men first started writing science fiction, maybe not interestingly, maybe this is obvious, you see women often as love interests, like the woman back there waving her hanky while her husband goes out on his jetpack, or they're damsels in distress who have to be rescued from bug-eyed monsters by heroic strapping men, often with large knives or good science. But science is boring on a cover, so you get a lot of knives instead. Having said that, like I said, you do have these Sheroes in here, and you really can see that really clearly in the last cover that I have there from Planet Stories. This is from Lee Brackett, and Lee Brackett was a woman, Black Amazon of Mars stories, and she's a character who begins as a kind of villain and then becomes the hero by the end of the story. All right, next slide. So I want to talk to you a little bit. I'm going to do a deep dive into one science fiction story from this time period. It's one that I love, and it's actually one that's in the book that Dr. Barr was showing you a minute ago, The Future is Female. This is a story by Leslie F. Stone called The Conquest of Gallea, and it's from 1931. Stone was one of the first women to publish in the science fiction magazines, and that's actually a picture of her from the magazines. So in the early magazines, they would have illustrations of all the authors, so you would have a sort of closer connection to the people you were reading. So as Stone remembers, Gernsback, the founding father of science fiction, quote, quite liked the fact that women were invading the field he had created. Stone herself originally turned to science fiction because her family didn't allow her to go to college to study science. She was well known for thrilling scientific romps through outer space that challenge characters and readers alike to rethink their assumptions about race, gender, and age. This is certainly true of The Conquest of Gallea, the story that I'm going to be talking about here in its broadest outlines. At first, it seems like a pretty basic story. It's a very typical alien invasion narrative. Aliens from a different planet invade the narrator's home world, and the narrator's people have to use all the science and technology at their disposal to fight off the alien threat. And if that sounds really pretty basic to you, that's because Stone was one of the first people to tell this kind of story. So what we're talking about here is where something like Independence Day, for instance, comes from. Or Mars Attacks, if you've ever seen that. That's a great movie. All right. Here, however, there's a little bit of a difference. The narrator and their people are not human men, which is what you usually expect, especially in early invasion narratives like this. Instead, they're actually alien women who must protect their homeworld of Venus, which they call Gallea, from invasion by men from Earth who want to transform their cool, cloudy planet into a tropical hotspot where they and the Martians can go on vacation. Yeah. In the end, you'll be happy to know, the Golan's trounce their human counterparts rather easily because they reject the kinds of dirty, mechanical technologies that the human men are using, and instead they use communally based telepathic powers. They're very clean technologies that allow them to control both the material world and the minds of men themselves. Stone remembers that this story caused quite a ruckus in the science fiction community, and it's easy to see why. Not only does Conquest reject the very technologies on which so much science fiction is predicated, but it's asking its readers, many of whom were likely human men, to side with the aliens and with the female aliens against human men themselves. To make matters worse, Stone refuses to let her Golans simply be angelic figures with whom we naturally side. her aliens are indeed strong, intelligent women, and they create new technologies based on their distinctly feminine and even feminist priorities. However, they are also vain and cruel beings who mock the physical features of other races and who use those differences to justify enslaving their own men and then performing horrible vivisection experiments on their alien captives. If you don't know what vivisection is, it's live experimentation on people. Yeah. So you're supposed to be siding with the aliens while they're cutting you up. It's a great story. It's fantastic. All right, and so I think what's really interesting is that in the end you realize there's not actually a lot of difference between the Earthers and the Golans, and that I think is actually the most feminist part of this story. It turns out women, like men, can be both heroes and total jerks. All right, next slide, please. All right, you ready to move on to the next period? Got it? Cool. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at the golden age of science fiction, which runs from the 1940s to the early 1960s. People talk about this as the golden age of science fiction because it's the period when science fiction really becomes central to both the American and the global imagination. And this was due largely to World War II. As the New York Times had noted, science fiction authors prior to World War II, they seemed to be in this ghetto where they were writing about crazy technologies that were atomic-driven rockets and even the possibility of artificial intelligence. After World War II, of course, where we did see the development of nuclear technologies and the beginning of computers, suddenly science fiction authors seem to be, and I'm quoting the Times here, prophets proven right by the course of events. Not surprisingly, this is the moment when science fiction really booms. You get, I think, 47 magazines. You have the beginning of science fiction radio, science fiction television, and Hollywood science fiction films. And it's also the moment when science fiction authors begin serving as corporate and government consultants. And that's something that they still do today. When you need someone to think outside the box of what's usually going on, you bring in a science fiction author, and they can run all kinds of crazy scenarios for you to help you think differently about whatever your issue is. Now, in this period, women still comprised about 15% of the science fiction community, but we do see the first female editors and publishers at this time. Most authors at this point are still primarily white and still primarily straight, but we also again see some of the first lesbian authors at this time. And in fact, one of them, whom I'm not going to talk much about, but just so you know, her name was Tigrina, and she took everything she learned in the science fiction community producing fan magazines and used it to produce the first lesbian fan magazine, essentially. That turned into a news magazine, and eventually she became a full-time reporter, and she is enshrined today in the Gay and Lesbian Journalist Hall of Fame. So I think that's pretty cool. But we're going to be talking about some other people as well here. So I just want to give you a sense of who some of these other women were who were involved in science fiction in the Golden Age. So Famous Fantastic Mysteries was the most financially successful magazine of that era, and it was run by Mary Nadinger, who was one of the first professional female science fiction editors. And she had a real gift for being able to figure out what people wanted to read. We have the second one, The Flame, is actually a science fiction poetry magazine, and that was edited by Lilith Lorraine. She had actually been in science fiction, the community, from the very, very beginning. She didn't love how commercial science fiction was becoming in the Golden Age, so she stepped back and she started doing what we call semi-prozine, something that's somewhere between a fan creation and a professional creation. And it really became the gateway for people who wanted to do science fiction poetry. So she published 3 of the first science fiction poetry magazines and the first anthology of science fiction poetry. And that was the anthology that had Capitalism Comes to Judgment in it, and that got her FBI file, actually. So Starlanes is interesting. Starlanes was primarily, it was just all fan fiction, but it was all done in poetry. It was edited by a woman from Detroit named Orma McCormick. And if you wanted to even write in a letter to the editor, it had to be in verse. So you always had to do everything in poetry. I know, it was cool. And then finally we have Judith Merrill. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about her, just so you know. Shadow on the Hearth is the beginning of a new kind of science fiction storytelling called women's science fiction or domestic science fiction. And this is a book talks about what would happen if World War III happened, but talks about it from a housewife's perspective and what it would be like to live in the suburbs and to have that experience. If you're interested in that, just so you know, it's also one of the first science fiction novels that was made into a made-for-TV movie in the 1950s. There's a movie called Atomic Attack. You can go find it online. It's fabulous. It's really, really fun to watch. Well, okay, as fun as World War III is going to be, but you get where I'm going here with this. Okay, good. What's interesting is that this is the time when women were first recognized as a distinct group within science fiction, and it was the first time that they had to grapple with difficult male editors as well. So we'll be talking a little bit about that too. So the main things that women did in terms of contributing to science fiction's development in this era, like I said, they developed something called women's science fiction or domestic science fiction that uses the family and the home as a focusing lens for science fiction. We tend to think about science fiction as happening in the public sphere. It happens in laboratories, it happens on launch pads, it happens on alien planets. But the reality is most of us experience science and technology most intimately and most prominently in the home through simple things, through the use of toilets and running water and air conditioning, something we all love in the American South, of course, right? And women really were thinking about that and thinking about how you could tell exciting, dramatic science fiction stories in the home itself. Women continue to expand the grammar of science fiction with the creation of a new kind of character called the housewife heroine, whose happiness or unhappiness was a barometer of her culture's success. Like the Shero before her, the housewife heroine is brave, intelligent, and stubborn. Here, however, she combines techno-scientific knowledge with domestic skills and affective labor to critique society and imagine new and better futures from the home outward. This kind of fiction had a very mixed reception. There was a vocal minority of fans who dismissed it as heartthrob and diaper fiction. And it kind of is, that's not entirely wrong, but most readers and every single editor I've come across loved this. They really saw it as a new spin on a genre that was becoming very well established. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so then we're gonna talk a little bit more, like I said, about Judith Merrill here and about her story, That Only a Mother from 1949. Judith Merrill was a member of the Futurians, which was a Pulp Era fan group that spawned some of the most important science fiction writers of mid-century America and maybe of science fiction ever. This includes people like Frederick Pohl, Isaac Asimov, and Virginia Kidd. Merrill herself got a start in science fiction and pretty much invented domestic science fiction single-handedly on a drunken bet with John W. Campbell, who was the leading editor of science fiction at that time. Campbell was part of the feminist backlash in the 1930s, and even though he had published in the early 30s with lots of first-generation women science fiction writers, by the time he became an editor, first of all, he chased a lot of women out because they just found him annoying. And we have like historical record people talking about that. And he would go around and say, well, women just can't really write science fiction. And so he was at a convention with Judith Merrill, and they were drinking, and she said, well, I bet you I can write a science fiction story, and you're gonna love it so much, you're gonna buy it from me and beg for more. And he's like, huh, never gonna happen, little lady. So she wrote the story, That Only a Mother, and he bought it from her, and he begged her for more. And then she gave him his next story, which was a space colonization story, and he sent it back, and he said, I don't want this, where are the housewives, where are the babies? So she went to other editors at that point, just so you know. But the cat was out of the bag, and a lot of people start writing these stories at this time. So That Only a Mother is set in a near future where World War II has dragged out and ultimately become World War III. The story revolves around a pregnant mathematician whose husband is away working on nuclear projects at Oak Ridge. She reads, in the big story begins, she's reading the newspaper, and she reads about a recent spike of mutated babies born in Japan, and the fathers who killed them, and the male police officers who refused to arrest the fathers, and then the male juries that refused to excuse them. As you can imagine, she starts to get a little nervous about what might happen to her right there at home in America. Fortunately, she's relieved when the baby is born, a seemingly beautiful genius. She has a face like a flower, she can talk intelligently at 4 months, and she can sing by 6 months once her teeth start coming in. And she can't understand why the doctors keep trying to take the baby from her. Her husband eventually comes home from Oak Ridge to see the baby and realizes it's a mutant, that it doesn't have arms or legs, and that his wife just doesn't see this. She seems to be insane. And so the story ends with the father panicking and his fingers tightening around the baby's neck. Yeah, I know. I had a class once that tried to tell me that he wasn't really killing the baby, he was hugging it, but I'm like, not a good hug, not a good hug at all. Right. So now this is a story that is supposed to be disturbing. It shows us how nuclear war can destroy rather than protect the family, and how an insane culture drives women crazy and kills its own future, literally. This kind of story is called a critical dystopia, and it's part of a mode of storytelling that gets its start in this time period. The idea in a critical dystopia is to get you thinking about not just, oh, what a horrible future that is, but what can I do in my own world to stop that future from happening? And we know that a lot of these kinds of dystopias that were written got science fiction readers out and into the growing anti-war movement. Okay, thanks. All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next part. This is where science fiction gets weird, you guys, okay? This is new wave science fiction. It goes from about the 1960s to the 1980s. So if the previous era was the golden age of science fiction, the era when science fiction sort of comes into its own, maybe into puberty, let's say, right? Sort of getting it together, moving towards its adult form. The new wave is its teenage years when it learns to smoke cigarettes and drink beer and steal its dad's car and crash it in front of the police station. So that's, or I could say science fiction becomes reflective and experimental at this point, but I think the first metaphor gives you a better sense of where we're gonna head here. One of the things that you start to see in this era is that as we're really developing computers and getting ourselves into space, it seems like the future is already with us. So science fiction authors have to start looking for different ways to make the genre feel fresh and new and relevant again. One of the things they do is they begin to shift and to think about how they can use the soft sciences, psychology, sociology, and anthropology, to explore human reactions to scientific and technological change. Authors also begin to use taboo subjects such as sex, drugs, rock and roll, and politics, which was a big no-no in science fiction up until that point, to give the genre an edge compatible with the progressive political energy of this era. You want to remember, this is the moment, the revival of feminism, the height of the civil rights movement, the height of the anti-war movement, and for many people see it as the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement as well, even though that had been going on for a while. So inspired by all of these things, and especially the revival of feminism, it's probably not a surprise that we see a lot of new women entering into the science fiction community at this time, and in fact, the numbers double almost overnight. A significant number of these new authors are self-identified feminists, and they're also self-identified African Americans and LGBT plus people. For the first time ever, women start to win the major science fiction awards, the Hugos, which are voted on by all the fans who go to Worldcon. Like I said, it's kind of a combination of the Oscars and the People's Choice Award. And women are also winning the Nebula Awards, which are kind of like the Golden Globes. They're given by professionals within the industry to each other. We also see that in this period, the creation of the first feminist awards, the first feminist conventions, the first feminist anthologies, and the first feminist presses. And we've got all this represented up here. So Women of Wonder is one of the first feminist science fiction anthologies, and my anthology, The Future is Female, is very much indebted to this. In fact, I'm on an award committee with Pamela Sargent, the editor of that, and I just always want to be like, oh, I'm so excited. You know, it's exciting to be able to work with the people who've inspired you like that. The next thing is WisCon. WisCon is the largest and oldest feminist science fiction convention in the world. If you're ever in Madison, Wisconsin on Memorial Day weekend, you should absolutely go check it out. It takes over the entire town, and it is a sight to behold, absolutely. We also have the Tiptree Award. That's just been renamed to the Otherwise Award. It's an award that's given out at WisCon every year for the best stories that explore science, technology, and gender. And it's called the James Tiptree Awards, actually named after an author named Alice Sheldon, who was a psychologist and a CIA agent. And she was a spooky kind of lady, and she didn't want to keep all her careers separate. So she needed a pen name, and she was grocery shopping. She picked up a jar of marmalade, and it was, I think, Tiptree Marmalade. And she's like, haha, that's my name. All right. Finally, then, Aqueduct Press is the oldest and largest feminist science fiction press. That's run by L. Timmel Deschamps. I just tell you this name so you can hear them. And it's a marvelous place if you're interested in women's science fiction to go and check out their offerings. We also see that women make their first, in science fiction, their representation, women in science fiction, let's try this again. Media representations of women in science fiction also begin to change in this period. How many of you have ever seen either Star Wars or Alien? Yeah. These are the first science fiction movies, and amongst some of the first movies in general where women pick up a gun and save themselves rather than waiting for men to do it for them. In part, I will admit, because the men all get eaten by aliens or they're too short to like really be good stormtroopers, but the women are there anyway, taking charge. All right, good. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So one of the women who was really central to the development of both new wave and feminist science fiction was Joanna Russ. She was pretty much the single-handed creator of feminist science fiction criticism. The fact that I'm here speaking to you today is because of the work that Russ did back in the 70s and 80s, both as a science fiction author, but also as a professor, I think at Cornell University. She was the creator of some of the first feminist science fiction writing and criticism, and a pioneer actually in lesbian fan fiction as well. As many of you know, do you guys know what fan fiction is? So this is yes, a lot of you are nodding, right? So fans often of different kinds of science fiction universes will want to write their own stories within it, and she was really excited about that, and she liked to put lesbians in her fan fiction. And now today it's a huge thing. Go look online. Just go Google fan fiction. You will be amazed at what you can find. There's even Thomas the Train fan fiction. You guys, it's everywhere. It's crazy. Joanna Russ was not writing Thomas the Train fan fiction, just so you know. She's known, though, for writing that's both savagely angry and savagely funny. It very much captures the spirit of feminism at that particular moment. Now, Russ had turned to science fiction as a teenager in the 1950s because it showed her worlds, quote, where things could be different. As an adult author, she would note that science fiction, quote, can't change people's minds, but it can crystallize an awful lot of what people are feeling at any given moment. This is certainly true of When It Changed, the 1972 story that won awards from both the science fiction and feminist communities alike for crystallizing the hopes and fears of women involved with the revival of feminism in the 1970s. The story opens with the narrator complaining that their wife drives like a maniac. Soon we learn that the narrator, Janet, is also a woman, and that both of these characters are from Whileaway, an all-female human colony planet whose inhabitants reproduce by chemically merging ova because all their males died out 30 generations earlier. The women of Whileaway complain and complain and complain that all they ever do is work and work and work. But it's really clear to us as readers that Whileaway is a feminist utopia where these Amazonian women can experience all aspects of human existence. They are mothers and lovers, but they're also police officers, duelers, and bear hunters. In short, the women of Whileaway are neither masculine nor feminine, they're just people. Now, all of this changes when it changed, right? When male astronauts from Earth come to Whileaway. The men who come to Whileaway claim that equality has been achieved on Earth and that they simply want to exchange genetic materials to improve both populations. But Janet, our narrator, is immediately suspicious of this story because the first thing that the men ask when they meet the women is, "Where are all your people?" Technically, it turns out this is a translation error, and the astronauts are trying to ask, "Where are all your men?" But the point is clear. Earthmen assume that women cannot rule themselves, and indeed, they basically assume that women are not really people at all. As the conversation continues, it also becomes clear to the Whileawayans that equality has not been achieved on Earth, and the human men are there to get eggs by any means necessary. In the end, Janet has to stop her wife from trying to kill the astronauts, but realizes, even though she's a cop, so she feels compelled to do this, but she realizes that their previously tranquil way of life is over forever. I know, sad story. So one thing that's interesting about this story is it's not entirely sad, right? It combines that kind of feminist utopian setting that we saw in the Conquest of Gallea with the critically dystopian thrust of That Only a Mother. This is a pretty common tactic in feminist science fiction of the time. You try to capture the energy of the current feminist moment by invoking all the different visions of the future that previous women writers have put together and then combine them into a single story. And in fact, just so you know, When It Changes has an ending that does not seem particularly hopeful, but that changes when you go to The Female Man, the book that Russ published just a few years later. And in this book, we learn that Whileaway does indeed remain a utopia, and it does so because women reach out to each other across different parts, across the multiverse, so across different universes, and band together to make sure that Whileaway will stay safe. All right, should we move on? Cool. Okay, so now we're going to get to contemporary science fiction, the thing that probably most of you are most interested in. So contemporary science fiction runs from about the 1980s to the present, and it's really the longest wave of science fiction we've had to date. You may have noticed that the earlier periods I talked about were only about 20 years in length. But contemporary science fiction's been going on for about 40 years. We see no end of it in sight. And it's become a lot harder to tell where one period ends and another one does for a number of reasons. In this last 4 decades, science fiction has gone global and digital in response to new computing and social media technologies that knit us together in new ways and that allow new authors to make their voices heard outside the confines of traditional publishing structures. And as that happens, this is part of, I think, why it's become so difficult to say, okay, this is the end of one period and the beginning of another, is because there's just so many different voices out there with so many different ideas, and not one single one has really become dominant in this period. Now, the number of women in print science fiction stays the same. We've been locked at about 30 to 35% since the 1970s. And interestingly, that's true in science as well. The number of women in science fiction almost always maps to the numbers of women in science. And there's no real good explanation for that, but it's something that's worth thinking about on your own. One thing that does change, though, in this period is that we see women do continue to make a number of firsts. Nora Jemisin, who I'd mentioned before, becomes the first author to win the prestigious Hugo Award 3 times in a row. Women create the first communities and awards for authors of color. And women really embrace and begin working with the first wave of trans science fiction authors in this era. The other key thing that happens in this time period is that women and non-binary artists start to make inroads in media science fiction, which largely has been a men's game up until this point. So we start to see women going into film, not just as actors, but as scriptwriters and directors, and of course going into gaming as game designers. So up here I wanted to give you, turn you on to some great stuff you might want to check out. Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet is one of the most innovative feminist science fiction magazines out there right now. And you can get a digital subscription, but I strongly recommend, if you're interested, that you get the print subscription, because then you can get the chocolate option, and they send you bars of fancy chocolate with each issue. Highly recommended, absolutely. Less exciting, well, because you don't get candy, but equally thrilling in terms of storytelling, Lightspeed Magazine. It's an all-purpose science fiction magazine. But as some of you might know, I don't know if you know about this, a few years ago, are you familiar with Gamergate? Does anyone know what Gamergate was? Okay, so like this happened about 5 years ago. A bunch of guys in the gaming community decided that women and people of color were ruining the fun of gaming for everyone, and that we needed to get them out of there. And the response to this was that Intel set up a $25 million, I think it was a $25 million foundation to start getting more women in science and technology. So obviously that didn't work. So the same guys who brought you Gamergate took the party to the science fiction community, where they were saying things like that Nora Jemisin was a half-ignorant savage, and that's what science proved. And then they advocated throwing acid in feminists' faces. Right? Because women were destroying science fiction. So one of the ways the science fiction community responded, or at least at Lightspeed Magazine, was they started a special issue called Women Destroy Science Fiction. And it's edited by, I'm forgetting who the editor is here, Christy Yant, and there's a number of other people who are involved in this as well. And so it's all women's writing, women's essays, women's fiction, women's art. And guess what? We didn't really destroy science fiction, we just made more of it. Fancy that. Right. For those of you who are more media-oriented, I don't want to leave you out. I'd recommend, if you've never seen it, you should check out Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames. It's the first feminist science fiction movie. It's from the 1980s. And what's really cool is a young actress named Catherine Bigelow was in that, and she would go on to be one of the first feminist science fiction directors in Hollywood. She directed Strange Days and a couple other films I'm forgetting right now. But again, check her out. My class is going to be watching Born in Flames next week. You should watch it too. And then we could all talk about it. It'd be fun. All right, and then finally, we've had a strong, women have been in gaming since the very beginning, and we don't always think about that, but River Raid was one of the first and most successful video games. It was put together by Carol Shaw, and I can't remember how much money it made, but it was ridiculous, and then they tried to do a sequel without her, and it bombed. It really needed Shaw's gift with gaming. So women's contributions in this time period, women continue to draw upon feminine and feminist ideas to expand their chosen genre in provocative ways. And like I said, it's hard to come up with just one particularly significant thing, but I want to talk to you about cyberpunk and the ways that women have taken on cyberpunk and reimagined the character of the hacker. I see some of you nodding, so we're getting into more familiar territory here. Cool. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with science fiction, cyberpunk stories imagine environmentally devastated near futures ruled by global corporations and gangs, where leather-clad hackers, technologically augmented street samurai or bodyguards, and secretive artificial intelligences compete for survival in both the virtual and physical worlds. So again, movie people, you might think of Blade Runner here, Tron, The Matrix. Is this starting to sound like you know these stories? Yeah, you do, sure. Now, it turns out male author to cyberpunk is often very pessimistic about the possibility of technocultural progress and expresses that pessimism through the figure of an alienated, isolated, nihilistic hacker. But stories written by women and non-binary authors flip that a little bit, and they replace that pessimism with an emphasis on creative self-expression, community, and change. Slide. Thank you. All right. And so I want to give you a wonderful example, and this is a story that I teach in my own classes, and I think we're going to be getting ready to read this next week in my science fiction class. It's a story by Veena Jimin Prasad called A Series of Stakes from 2017. Veena Jimin Prasad is a Singaporean science fiction author who describes herself as, quote, working against the world machine. Her first two stories were Fandom for Robots and A Series of Stakes. They both came out in 2017, and they were both nominated for Nebula, Hugo, and Theodore Sturgeon Awards. So this is like getting the Golden Globe, People's Choice, and Oscar nominations all at once. She was also a finalist for the 2018 John W. Campbell Award for Best New Author. I think this last honor is particularly funny because you remember Campbell, the guy who got drunk and made the bet with Judith Merrill? He would be rolling in his grave if he read this story. So it's pretty great. So the story itself follows the adventures of Helen Lee Yun-Wai, an art student turned hacker who uses her design skills to forge authentic looking, smelling, and tasting meat in a world where animals have become endangered and so people aren't eating real meat anymore. Now this would actually be a good job because everyone really likes synthesized meats, it turns out, except that Helen is on the run from the law after her male university instructors threw her under the bus for the failure of an artificial heart that they had designed and she had only been tangentially involved with. And then the family of the woman who received the heart sets out to punish her. The situation is exacerbated when the owner of the last remaining beef empire in the world blackmails her into creating a series of 200 perfect steaks for his daughter's wedding because his own cattle have all died and he doesn't want anyone to know about that. And then he sends out thugs to start cutting her up when she can't keep to his impossible schedule. Luckily for Helena, though, she's not alone. To complete her job in a timely manner, Helena hires Lily Yonezawa to help her, and despite her efforts to keep Lily at a distance, the two grow close as they bond over the creative challenges of printing the steaks. Now, Lily presents herself as a kind of flaky rocker chick, but it turns out she's actually an expert hacker with extensive experience in both black market organ printing and killing people who get in her way. This turns out to be handy, because as the women fall in love, Lily has to save Helen from certain death at their employer's hands. Finally, the new community of two decide that they're going to use their hacking skills to get a rather creative revenge on the steak baron. They do this by burning the image of a happy cow with a little heart around it onto the T-bones of each steak, so that as the wedding guests are eating their meal, the beef baron's deception will be revealed as the bone becomes apparent. Meanwhile, the two women take the money from their forgery and leave China altogether to start new lives as artists elsewhere in the world. So, like Joanna Russ, Prasad pays homage to the history of women's science fiction by showing us both how women can be isolated and trapped by patriarchal cultural arrangements, but also how they might connect with each other and use their technoscientific skills to enact meaningful change. Here, however, she reverses the valences of Russ's story, right? Celebrating the possibility that there might indeed be enough women in the world to fight off patriarchy and create new futures. As such, her story, in my eyes, is a metaphor for the entire history of women's work in science fiction. Okay, one last slide. Thanks. So in conclusion, I want to return to the idea of science fiction as a global language. And I think that this is important not just because it allows readers to connect with one another, but because for many women, and indeed many people, one of the best and most effective ways we can intervene into narratives of science, technology, and gender that are not of our own making is writing science fiction, right? Women are often the subjects of scientific scrutiny and the targets of technological manipulation. Science fiction, though, can serve as a kind of feminist fairy tale that allows us to call out the patterns of gender discrimination in the modern world and to imagine how women might use science and technology differently to build truly new and different and more equitable futures for all. And as I hope this final slide makes clear, it wasn't just 2018 that was the year of the woman in the media or in science fiction, but women writers continue to make their mark on the public imagination today. Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.